Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Indian Genes. We have a very special guest for you today. And in fact, over the last few months, we have been getting a lot of requests from you. A lot of students have been writing into us, asking us about the field of art, where a lot of you are studying uh, either the formulative arts or writing, producing, directing. Our guest today is an absolute genius at what we're going to be talking about, and that is storytelling. We couldn't have got any better guest than who we're going to speak to today. Just to remind all our viewers as well, and a big thank you to him because he, in fact, was guest number 5 on this podcast and was gracious enough the last time to spend time with us. But we've got him back now. You're going to listen to him. He has been working in the film industry. He's also involved with writing academies all over the world. He's spoken and has been featured on BBC. He's involved with most of the Hollywood writing scripts and productions, support, help. He's also involved with a lot of the serials that you're watching online today. But I'm going to stop the introduction from my end and let him speak to you more. So, without wasting too much more time, Indian Genes now very proudly introduces to you the guest for tonight, none other than John Bucher. So, John, from everybody here in India, and a very, very, very big welcome to you. It's amazing to see you back again. And I was, in fact, just speaking about this particular podcast to somebody before, and I said the feedback from a lot of our listeners was really positive. They wanted to have you back, so you're back here actually a lot because of what I wanted to speak to you, but on popular demand. I'm going to stop, John. Introduce yourself to our audience and let them know a little bit more about you, John.
Absolutely. Well, it is a pleasure to be back. As I stated the first time I was on the podcast, India is a very special place to me. And as a storyteller, I feel such a connection with India because the world has been gifted so much powerful storytelling from the Indian people, from the ancient stories that have been passed down through the years, through our modern stories that come through Bollywood and all of the wonderful outlets there in India. I feel as though even though I work professionally in storytelling, I will constantly remain a student of Indian storytelling because it is so profound and it has been so historically important throughout the world. So it really is an honor to be back here on the Indian Genes podcast. And since I have seen you last, have continued my travels around the world. I have continued to work here in Hollywood with a number of different productions and films and television shows and comics, graphic novels, books, because at the baseline of each one of these mediums, of course, is storytelling. I believe if we can come to understand storytelling in a more profound and in depth way, we are able to benefit regardless of what our particular discipline is. Perhaps we're working in science, perhaps we're working in technology, perhaps we are working in the arts. Whatever our particular discipline is, having a strong base in storytelling will just make us that much better at what we do in the world.
Absolutely. And I think also because of what you've just mentioned, the connectivity today, because of the internet, because of technology that you have, probably in the earlier days, it was just through communication via either books, newspapers, and it took time. Those stories were probably carried by person to person, from location to location, and it was all in your mind or head. But John, now, before we even go down this road, and Obviously, whenever we speak to you or anybody speaks to you, we are all excited about trying to hear and understand a little bit more about Joseph Campbell and the foundation he has. What was his vision? And this particular name is synonymous with every storyteller today. He's a legend for a lot of us, and I'm sure for a lot of people in your field. So why don't you
Yes.
give us a little bit of insight into what he was like? What was his vision when he started out?
Yes. Yes, thank you for asking about this. And Joseph Campbell was such an important figure in storytelling. He was what we would call a mythologist, someone who studied the ancient stories that come from each tradition around the world. He was also someone, however, who tried to get down to the psychological meanings of these stories. Perhaps his most famous idea, which was presented in a book he wrote in 1949 called The Hero with a Thousand Faces, is the idea of the hero's journey. And basically, the idea of the hero's journey was something that, as he read all ancient literature, he saw these patterns and these connections that existed amongst groups of people that had never met each other. So he saw the same patterns in the Greek stories of the Odyssey, in the Iliad, that he saw in the Mahabharata, in the stories that come from the culture of India. He saw these same patterns, these same motifs exist in stories that came from Africa and Latin America. And his idea was that there must be some sort of universal pattern that he called the hero's journey. And it evolved a character who went from that character's normal world into a very different world to try and solve a problem or bring back a solution to the problem. This character going on a very difficult journey, securing the answer or solution to the problem, and then bringing the answer back home where that character began. We see this not only in storytelling, but we see this also in great archetypal characters from history, from literature, from mythology. This is a pattern that we see over and over. So, Joseph Campbell's core idea was there seems to be some connection between groups of people and the way they tell stories and the meanings they derive from stories all over the world. And he was the first to really articulate this idea in a way that connected and landed with people. And now we see this idea playing itself out in many, many television shows, many films, many books, many comics. We continue to see this idea move forward. It really reached its pinnacle after a creator named George Lucas read The Hero with a Thousand Faces and fell in love with Campbell's idea and used it to inform a sci-fi space story he was creating called Star Wars. And Star Wars is perhaps the most on the nose particular example of the hero's journey where each step is followed. And obviously, the success of Star Wars tells us that there was something there that really connected to people all over the world. And storytellers like myself have suggested that perhaps it was not just the great special effects or the wonderful characters, but that it was this pattern, this motif of the hero's journey that really landed with people internationally all over the world.
Right. And also, when you spoke about this particular journey and The Hero with a Thousand Faces, the book, before I read the book, I do follow a lot of movie and film and stories. I did not realize what was so obvious. And then when you begin to apply those principles, you can never forget it after that. It just comes back to you. And every time you watch something, it's there then. For people who are just enjoying watching film, or for somebody who is a budding film writer, a storyteller, an author, as a framework, uh, let us know what the main areas or breakdown of this particular cycle is, so people
Yes.
can absorb it?
Absolutely, absolutely, and I will go through some of the stages, and I also want to mention that if you, in particular, are someone who works in the arts, if you work or are desiring to work in film or television or writing novels or in fashion or some other art form, there's a particular book that takes Campbell's ideas and makes these ideas especially understandable to people working in the arts. And this is a book called The Writer's Journey, and it's written by a friend of mine named Christopher Vogler, Vogler. It's a very powerful book, and it's very helpful to people who want to understand this idea in the context of the arts or entertainment. Now, the way that the framework, the hero's journey works is we always begin with a character, this protagonist, this hero who is having some sort of experience in their normal world. And that experience may be that they are quite happy and comfortable in their normal world, and something is going to come along and jolt them out of that normal world. However, in some stories, we begin with a character who is very dissatisfied with their normal world. This character may be someone who says, "This that is happening is unsustainable. I can no longer go on this way." And that character will often decide to leave home, to leave their normal world, and to go out on a journey trying to find a way to fix what is broken back at home. Now, the first step that is one of the most famous steps of the hero's journey is called the call to adventure step. And what happens is something comes along which serves as an invitation for that character to leave home and go out on their journey. Now, sometimes, as I mentioned, this invitation is a very dark and deadly invitation. For example, the character may lose their family, their friends. They may lose all that has made them comfortable at home. And they're forced to go out on a journey to fight the forces that have taken from them. In other types of stories, the character may have a sense that there's something out there waiting for them, something that they're longing for, but they don't know exactly how to describe it. And in stories like this, oftentimes something comes along that serves as an invitation to take that character out of the normal world and on this journey. Many times that invitation comes in the form of another character. Perhaps a wise old man shows up in town and invites this character to go out on a journey with him. Whatever the situation, once the character has been invited on this journey, there often is a bit of reluctance in the character where the character refuses the call to adventure. They say, you know, I don't know if I want to go on this journey because it may be dangerous. I might be inconvenienced. It may be deadly. In some cases, the character says, I don't know if we'll be back in time to eat my dinner, so I don't think I can go. But something always happens that reverses this and forces the character to go out on the journey. At this point, they cross the first threshold. And in this motif or in this stage, the character does something, says something, or takes an action that they can no longer turn back. They've crossed a bridge to go out on this journey, and there's no turning back at this point. Now, along the way, they may encounter what are called threshold guardians. These are characters that try and keep them from being able to move forward to the next step in the journey. Sometimes these threshold guardians are actual warriors or actual guards. Other times, these are characters who present a certain type of thinking that tries to keep the character from moving forward. However, once the character has decided to move forward, there are often characters that come along that assist the character. There may be a goddess who comes in and assists the character in getting to the next stage in the journey. There may be a mentor character that comes along and assists the character with getting to the next stage in the journey. But even with this help, the character will encounter a road of trials, difficulties that cause the character to want to give up, to want to just turn around and try and go back home. But things happen that encourage the character to keep moving forward. And eventually, the character reaches success. They find what it is they've been searching for, they find the solution to the problem. Then, however, the journey is only half over because the character must take that solution. They must take this thing that they've been looking for and they must bring it back home. They must bring it back home for the healing of their land or the healing of a person or the benefit of the entire community. And many times, the journey back home with whatever that they have found, this boon, can be just as dangerous, if not more dangerous. It can be even more difficult than the journey to find the boon. However, once the character succeeds in bringing this boon back to their community, the community is transformed. But the character has also been transformed and doesn't sometimes recognize the community that they have come home to because that community feels very different. And it's not that the community has changed, it's that the character has changed. For what we learn about the hero's journey is this: the hero, once they go on the journey, the point becomes not in getting the solution, but the point becomes the transformation of the character into the best version that they can be. They have changed, they have become a better person, they have learned a lesson, and now they are different at the end of this journey than when they began.
That's an amazing summary, John. And while you were talking, I was thinking about Game of Thrones.
Oh,
And I
yes.
think that was about 74 hours or 76 hours of content that was put out. But I began to follow that particular serial. And after reading and speaking to you, it's quite obvious there that there's a continuous journey. And exactly like you said, every character there, and the good thing there was every character was going on their own journey. But as you said, in a script that is more than one dimension, it can get even more interesting if there are many hero journeys going on at one time rather than one journey that you're following. And is that is that something that I was thinking about? What do you think about that?
I completely agree. I think in many modern stories, each character within the story is going on their own journey. I also think there is something interesting that we've seen happen in the last few years that is a reflection of what we have seen in ancient stories. And that is, even though there may be a singular hero, there often is a collective journey that happens among the characters. What's interesting about this is we've seen the popularity of the Marvel films, the Avengers. And the Avengers are about this group of heroes who go on a journey together, and they each have their own role. We may feel like this is a new idea. However, if we look back at our ancient stories, and especially many of the ancient stories that have arisen out of India, we see stories of groups of cousins who go on journeys together and who are involved in a story, each having perhaps their own particular role, but this collective journey of a group of people that are moving towards something, moving towards a solution to try and bring to their people. So I think that we must have the complexity of thought to be able to hold both the individual journey of the hero or the protagonist, but also the collective journey. And I think Game of Thrones is an excellent example because we might look at a particular character's journey, say Jon Snow, and we can look at Jon Snow's heroic journey within the Game of Thrones storyline. However, Jon Snow is certainly not the only character in Game of Thrones. There are a number of characters, and we see these different characters having their own journeys, but we also see, for example, the Lannister family having their own journey in Game of Thrones, this collective group of people that has their own journey. So I think the more that we understand about how these stories work and they serve these patterns and motifs, the more we understand about the complexity of both ancient storytelling and modern storytelling. And in understanding the complexity of this, we see how stories work in our real lives. Because while I may be an individual who has a journey that I'm going on and things I'm trying to accomplish, I'm also a part of a family. I'm also a part of a community. I'm also a part of a country. And each one of these different collectives or groups has their own journey that they're going on. And we're a part of so many different groups, and yet we have our own individual journey. So I think part of understanding the complexity of storytelling is being able to hold both of these ideas at the same time.
Right. And I think through mythology as well, and in this cycle that you just spoke about, the teacher that comes along, you spoke about Star Trek, we can talk about Batman, we can talk about probably the mythological stories as well. Now, how important is this teacher? Besides the story that you just spoke about, I think all of us in our lives recount, recollect a teacher, a mentor, or somebody that has come in just at the right moment
That's right.
to probably get you to understand your potential and release that potential in some way and guide you in the right direction. So, this teacher character, how important is that?
The teacher or mentor character is essential because all of us need individuals to come into our life and our journey and help us understand what we cannot understand. If we understood everything, we would not need teachers, we would not need mentors. But of course, that's not the way that life works. We all are able to speak our language because someone taught us to speak our language. We all are able to even put on our clothes each day because someone showed us when we were very small how to put on our clothes. Everything that we do in the world is usually because someone taught us, someone showed us how to do that thing. As we get older, we often become very self reliant, feeling as though we don't need anyone to show us the path. We don't need anyone to show us the way. We know we have things figured out. However, this is a moment when our ego rises and our ego tells us we don't need anyone else. Part of the lesson a character learns in a story often involves the death of the ego. In other words, learning that we can't do it ourselves. We need others. We need the wisdom of teachers. We need the wisdom of elders. We need to understand ideas that may be foreign to us in order to get where we're trying to go in the world. I believe the most powerful stories are about stories where the main character, the protagonist, is an eternal student.
I'll just reference a couple of films here. Christopher Nolan's Batman, and then we can talk about V for Vendetta probably. There's a scene in Batman where the character is in a well, he's deep in a well, he's trying to climb out of that well, and he struggles there. It's, you could call it near death, you could call it death of your ego. And at the same time, if you look at V for Vendetta, there is a scene where the female character there is locked in a room. she's probably facing death, or I mean, she thinks he's dead. And then, like you said, I'll add a third one there, which was Jon Snow. Jon Snow literally died and came back, right? So these are three different versions of probably the same thing that you are talking to us about.
That's right. That's exactly right. And there's a reason why we see in these stories, in these films, whether it be V for Vendetta or Game of Thrones, there's a reason why we see these sequences where a character faces this death. Because it's exactly what you were just saying, that it represents or symbolizes the death of the ego. Interestingly enough, every major wisdom tradition in the world focuses on this idea of the death of the ego. And so it becomes essential through the story that whatever has been holding the character back at the beginning of the story, whatever lesson they need to learn, whatever they need to overcome, we need to understand this at the beginning of the story. We need to understand a character's weakness. We need to understand where that character's ego has gotten out of control. It's interesting to look at this through the framework of the story of Spider-Man, the great Marvel superhero. Because in the origin stories of Spider-Man, when Spider-Man first receives his powers and he first starts learning how to use his webs to swing from building to building, he is terrible at this. He falls, he crashes. He is not good at using this new gift, this new skill at all. This is an essential part of the story because we recognize that his ego must be brought back down into check. It must be checked because otherwise his ego may grow too big with these new superpowers that he has. Whatever a character's strength is, it must be balanced with a certain level of weakness or vulnerability in order for that character to be able to grow. If the character has no weaknesses, there's no way that the character can grow. So, we often, when we create stories, we tend to create characters that feel very much like ourselves. This can be a real problem for those that create stories because many times we're not in touch with our own weaknesses and we don't want others to see our weaknesses. We try and hide our weaknesses. And many of us try and do this when we create characters and stories. We try and hide that character's weaknesses. However, it becomes essential that we expose that character's weakness. And many times it is not necessarily the character's ego has gotten too big. It may be another type of vulnerability. For example, perhaps the character's vulnerability or their weakness is their family. Perhaps they are willing to go too far for their family. They're willing to betray their values in order to save their family, and this can cause a real complexity when working with Hollywood studios. One of the ways that I encourage them in their story is to have a character choose between two really difficult choices. These choices may be good choices. Maybe you have to choose between taking a wonderful job or staying in home and going to a wonderful school you've gotten a scholarship to. Both good choices. But many times in a story, a character must choose between two terrible choices, between sacrificing themselves in order to save someone else or refusing to save someone and bearing the burden of that guilt. Often the choices are between two very difficult choices. But remember this, storytelling becomes compelling when we force characters into situations where they must make a choice. Audiences don't necessarily want to see stories where things just happen to characters and they're victims of the circumstances that they're in. Audiences love to see characters who make strong choices, even if they're the wrong choice, because it reminds us of the agency we have as human beings, that we too have a choice. And sometimes we make the wrong choice and we must deal with the consequences of it. But it is essential that we still have a choice.
Right. And when you mentioned about the death of the ego, or the particular character going through that first and then having to make a choice. Now, I also know that, or I've heard that Joseph Campbell was influenced by or did meet the famous Indian philosopher uh, Jiddu Krishnamurti. And
Yes.
there is some, so when you listen to Jiddu Krishnamurti's teachings or what he has been talking about, it's quite similar on those lines. So do you think that that is a strand that has come into this hero's journey?
It's interesting that you asked me previously about, teachers in our lives, because uh, Jiddu Krishnamurti was a teacher in Joseph Campbell's life. He met Krishnamurti at a young age, and they maintained a friendship and a relationship where Krishnamurti would speak wisdom to Joseph Campbell throughout the course of his life. And Krishnamurti's teachings about the death of the ego had a profound impact on Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell um, greatly valued the ancient stories that came from India, and knew that there were wisdom in the traditions there that he needed to learn. And the only way that we can really learn these things, aside from reading books, is to have someone from that tradition who imparts that wisdom to us, who teaches us. And Joseph Campbell found this in Jiddu Krishnamurti.
Interesting, because these are such extremely opposing philosophies, and it actually plays on your mind, because also when you talk about Joseph Campbell, he was influenced then by probably Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. Now
Yes.
these are the other spectrum teachers, right? That's
Yeah.
where they're telling you to grab what you have, make your own decision. You're leading the life you want to lead. So when you spoke earlier about this conflict from a hero, where you get through the stage but now you need to make a choice, so that sinks in beautifully with the next two philosophers, if he was influenced by them, which was Schopenhauer and Nietzsche.
And he was very influenced by both of these thinkers. And I find it highly interesting that um, we see, as you described, often somewhat opposing ideas here in play. But one of the things that Krishnamurti, had really conveyed to Joseph Campbell was the importance in philosophies of being able to hold two opposing ideas at the same time, and that they could both be true. Another person that influenced Joseph Campbell was the Swiss psychologist Carl Jung. And Carl Jung talked about the tension of the opposites. Carl Jung was also greatly influenced by thinking from India, and he had this idea of holding the tension of the opposites, being able to hold the fact that the ego must completely be disseminated and die, and at the same time, or decimated and die, and at the same time, we must make decisions. We must have values. We must take steps. We must have convictions. We must take action. So, how do we do both of those things if the ego is completely decimated and we still must make choices? Well, this is the tension of the opposites. And both wisdom traditions, and Carl Jung articulated this nicely, but wisdom traditions tell us that there is a transcendence that takes place between the tension of the opposites. In other words, somewhere between these two opposing ideas emerges a third way that we're able to hold both of these things and yet find a way forward in holding both values at the same time. And it is in that transcendence that we experience something that feels beyond ourselves, beyond human. And even those who value the science of these things can see examples where oftentimes in scientific thinking there seemed to have been a binary where there were just two ideas that opposed, and suddenly a third idea has emerged from between the tension of those two ideas. So I think this is an idea that exists in wisdom traditions, but it also is an idea that exists deep in the human psyche, that we tend to find a way forward when there seems to be no way forward, and when both paths seem to hold no promise for us.
Right, and interestingly, you mentioned Carl Jung, and that's the reason I love to hear you speaking when you connect this, because Carl Jung also spoke about archetypes and collective consciousness, and I've heard you speaking about mythology. When you connect this to a global mythology, I think there was a term that was used that was called the monomyth that
Yes.
Joseph Campbell came up with, and Carl Jung spoke about a collective consciousness. So when you talk about this mythology that seems to be resonating with everybody on this planet, and there is a lot of patterns of similarity, does that mean, or I'm not implying it means,
Yeah.
then these myths become even more powerful, right?
That's exactly right. And, Joseph Campbell was very influenced by Carl Jung's idea of the collective unconscious, and these archetypes that tend to exist in the world, these patterns, these motifs, these characters that arise at different points in history between different groups of people that never really met each other or had contact with each other, or that existed thousands of years apart. I'll give you one example of this. There is an ancient Sumerian myth that discusses the story or the descent of a character named Inanna. Now, in some traditions, she's referred to as Ishtar, but the descent of Inanna tells this story of this feminine goddess, this deity who goes on an underworld journey, that descends down into the underworld for a purpose, to go on a journey. Well, many years later, in the Greek tradition, we have the story of Persephone, which is also a goddess that goes on this underworld journey. The story is very different in many ways, but this idea of a goddess who descends to go on this underworld journey and has these different motifs that she experiences, we see this motif in a number of different countries around the world and different points in history, with groups of people that there's not much evidence they ever spoke to each other or had contact with each other. And even if they did, there are thousands of years that separate these stories sometimes. Well, this began to, create this curiosity within Carl Jung that perhaps there's a collective unconscious. Perhaps there's some sort of energy that these ideas spring forth out of, and occasionally human beings are able to tap into that energy, and that these motifs, these characters, these stories emerge from that energy and connect to us, because they connect to our psyches, the psychological aspect of who we are. And there's still very much to learn about this. It's a theory that is very new. It's very young, and we're still exploring, how this could work and what this means. But there's compelling examples that point towards something, and it's mysterious. Joseph Campbell once said that many of us get very caught up in the finger pointing towards the moon rather than the moon itself. We get very interested in the practical, the sign, the symbol, as opposed to what the sign or symbol is representing. And of course, that's our human nature that does that. But when we start to transcend that human nature and try and understand a deeper essence of these mysteries, these things which have, at least thus far, been beyond our understanding, I think we get into a field of much more interesting questions.
True. And speaking about Anana and Persephone, the story that you did mention, that correct me if I'm wrong, they do get connected to the fertility myth, because
That's right.
I think Persephone spends about 6 months of the year in the underground, or mythologically with Hades,
Right.
because that's how nature works around on this planet. When you have the different seasons, and then you have fertilization and cultivation, and farmers are doing what they're doing. So it's not only a specific story that you just mentioned, and you're looking at the finger and forgetting the moon, but the moon in this case is the bigger story here about fertilization on the planet that would have happened all over the world, right?
That's exactly right. Exactly right. And we see also another example of this would be how many different cultures have flood myths. Myths that involve a great flood occurring. And certainly there is, a very practical explanation that many cultures experienced floods, but there seems to be certain nuances and aspects to these flood myths that seem to speak to something greater. Are these flood myths just a finger pointing towards the moon as opposed to the moon itself? Could these flood myths speak to something psychological in the human condition? When we feel overwhelmed, when we feel like our psyche has been flooded. Um, Many of these stories speak to psychological conditions that are universal to the human condition that so many people experience, and the experience is better contained in a metaphor, in a story, in a symbol, because it makes it more universal. The more specific we get with these symbols, with these stories, with these motifs, the less universal they become. So their power relies in the universality many times of these particular stories, which again I think is why flood stories are so universal around the world.
Right. So is there a possibility that these myths, or some of these myths, not only are stories about what is happening, but is there a possibility that there could be warnings? Because when you talk about a flood myth,
Yeah,
maybe there was a global event, a catastrophe around the world that did happen at some time. We speak about the ice age and the pre-ice age, and so with these stories, are we being reminded, are we being told by people from the past that we need to be careful, that this could happen again?
absolutely. And I think we see this in even more subtle ways sometimes. For example, one of the oldest human stories that we have on record is a story that we refer to now as the Epic of Gilgamesh. And the Epic of Gilgamesh begins with an interesting idea. It begins by saying King Gilgamesh ruled over his kingdom for 10,000 years. Now, I don't think the idea there was that there was a king that ruled for 10,000 years. My belief is that the writer of this was writing symbolically, metaphorically, and that it felt like this person had been king for 10,000 years. And this, I think, speaks to what you were saying about it feeling like a warning that the story of Gilgamesh unfolds when a king may have been in power for too long. And perhaps the Epic of Gilgamesh serves as a warning for our leaders staying in power too long. Now, there's a many different ways we can interpret that, but this goes back to me to what the essence of art is. And the essence of art is speaking different things to different people. There's a wonderful um, ancient story that talks about a very wise man who came to a village one night, and he sat with the village elders, and he sat and he spoke with them, and they had food and they enjoyed conversation. And then the wise man, he moved on to the next village. And as the village elders were walking back to their homes that night, there was an interesting conversation that pursued. One of the village elders said, I have to apologize to all of you because the wise teacher sat and spoke to me the entire evening and didn't even speak to the rest of you. And one of the other village elders said, that is absurd. The village elder sat and spoke to me the entire evening and had nothing to say to the rest of you. And yet the third stepped up and said, I don't know what you two are talking about. I spent the entire evening talking with the village elder, and the wise man spoke to me the entire night, and not to the two of you. And the point of this story is that oftentimes when someone comes and brings wisdom, it feels like they're speaking directly to us, and that no one else matters. And I believe that's what good art does as well. Art many times will communicate something to one person and something completely different to another person. This is the power of art, is it transforms into what each individual person needs to take from the experience, from the symbol, from the motif, from the story. And that is perhaps something that connects art to the collective unconscious, because there can be a painting made by someone who we don't share language, culture, or any other commonalities with. And yet that painting speaks deeply to us. What is it about art that can connect people on a level that transcends language and culture and everything that would divide people? This is a great mystery that is of great interest to me.
Truly very interesting. And you spoke about Gilgamesh. I want to come back to art, but just to circle back to Gilgamesh, when you mentioned about the writer said this particular king lived for 10,000 years. Now, we do know that in the ancient time, when we look at language, or we think language evolved as metaphors initially, right? So when you say time is a river, time is not literally a river, but that's how language evolved. We
Yes.
now have probably 40, 50,000 words or 100,000 words more than what they had. So they would have to use metaphors. Today, you know that there's a new word on social media or on TikTok or Instagram every second day, and then we start atomizing this whole language and defining it. But in those days, stories were probably the most powerful or potent weapon to pass a message across.
That's exactly right. I love that point you make. That's interesting because we keep inventing new words all the time. I have nephews who are on, these social media sites, and they were saying to me the other day that someone had Riz, and I said, I don't know what Riz is, and they said, oh, it's short for charisma. This person has appeal. And I'm reminded how we are continuing not only creating new words, but taking existing words, shortening them, expanding their meaning. We are constantly evolving our language. And this goes back to what you just said, why story and storytelling is so important.
Right. And mentioning art that you were talking about now, this gets back again to the archetype, right? And there are certain forms or certain designs that collectively all of us know that when we see it, we know it's good. A particular painting in some part of the world is always a good painting. Let's take Mona Lisa. It's a good
Right,
painting anywhere in the world. And
right.
when we also talk about looking at what nature is offering to us, probably we come up with, when we talk about aesthetics, so we talk about symmetry in nature.
That's right.
And
That's
when you
right.
look at a good art form, the first thing probably the human eye would catch is the symmetry. And the
Yes.
moment there is asymmetry, whether it's a human face or whether it is the uncanny valley, when you talk about AI art, and
Yes.
how do you make a robot look like a human? Because even if you go 2% or 5% on the other side, it looks scary.
Yeah.
So this is built into our psyche anyways, right? With art as well. And that's quite obvious.
I completely agree. That is one of the reasons that art is so fascinating to me is this idea of symmetry. There's also, a lot of interesting conversations around the golden mean, which is a particular framework for what makes something beautiful, in the eyes of human beings. And I'm reminded of the universal symbolism of things that appear in art that we all share. How often trees appear in art, and what a powerful universal symbol a tree is. How often water appears in art. How often mountains appear in art. And these are things that we share across cultures, across languages, but also how often the human body or human beings appear in art. We might not have anything in common with the subject of a particular painting, and yet we share the emotion that that individual in the painting is experiencing. And when it comes to artificial intelligence, I think there's a lot of interesting discussion happening right now, especially in this intersection of art and artificial intelligence. And I think that we definitely want to proceed with cautious optimism. Um, but I also think that sometimes we very quickly let our fear around these things overwhelm the possibilities of what could be. I am a deep lover of art, but I also believe that technology can propel us into new epochs of the human experience. And I am exploring the idea now of if it's possible that perhaps artificial intelligence could help usher in a new era of human thriving unlike any we've ever experienced before. With every major technological revolution, we have experienced a great amount of fear around that. And we've been able to overcome and transcend that fear. And that is my hope as well with artificial intelligence. I think that there's something very mythic and mythical about artificial intelligence in that just as ancient peoples would go to temples and pray to deities that were beyond the human experience. We are now going online and turning to these motifs, these artificial intelligences that seem to have wisdom or at least knowledge beyond the human experience. So I think there's something very interesting psychologically between the relationship between human beings and AI and ancient relationships between human beings and deities. There's something I think to explore there.
Right. And you spoke about the Avengers, or you spoke about the superhero stories. And for some reason, you could correct me if I'm wrong, over the last few years, these particular stories have not got the mileage or they have not done as well as they were doing, let's say, 10 years ago when they
That's
did
right.
come out.
That's
Now, I
right.
know that you talk a lot about telling a better story. So
Yes.
that's where I want to get this in from you and understand that are we at a pinnacle? Are we at a point in storytelling or our culture that we need to relook at what's happening, keep the formula, but somehow we need to get some more interesting stories out there or tell it in a different way? And I want your take on that because that's very fresh and it would be very exciting for us.
Absolutely. And I do believe we are at a point in storytelling that we need a better story. See, part of the issue becomes that what one person says is a good story may be not a good story for someone else. And we're having a lot of disagreement in culture around what a good story is and what a good story for one person or one group may be very different for another group or another person. So I think the one thing we could all agree on is perhaps there's a better story than what we have now. And I mean that both on a broad global level and on specific stories in Hollywood. I think there are better stories to be told. Part of the hope that I have around us telling a better story through the films and television shows and books that we create is that we will return to what made the ancient stories great. And that is the themes and the simplicity. One of the problems that I believe the Marvel movies got wrapped up into is complexity. The stories became so complex, you had to understand what had happened in 20 movies before you saw this movie, and the stories became in many ways so complex that they ended up wrapping themselves up into a knot, in my opinion. However, I believe that a return to simple stories around what it means to be human can be very powerful. And I believe that should be the future of storytelling. Now, those stories can be wrapped up in many different genres. They can be told in the world of sci-fi and the world of dramas or comedies or whatever genre we want to wrap those stories up in. But I believe we're going to have to stop sacrificing good human-based storytelling for amazing effects or just relying on what has worked in the past. One of the reasons that I think the Marvel movies have didn't do as well, in the last couple of years, is that people had they had eaten from that table and they had gotten very full, and yet we kept bringing out more food that tasted exactly the same, and people didn't want to keep eating. They were full of that food. So I think it becomes essential for us as storytellers to return to the roots of simple human-based storytelling, wrapping that in the most creative worlds and characters that we can ever imagine. I tell storytellers this: the secret to great stories, simple story, complex character. Keep the story as simple as possible, but make the characters as complex as possible because we as human beings are very complex.
Now, do you also think when you talk about we need to tell better stories is the scale? Because a few years ago, you had five films coming out on the blockbuster summer, and then you had 10 more, and you had a few books. But today, every platform online has movies and stories and serials. Like we just spoke about Game of Thrones, 72 hours.
Yeah,
72 hours in a good old day would be probably 30 movies.
yeah,
And where do you get these writers to come up with that kind of information? So it becomes a task more than I can sit and reflect and write what I want to write. No, you can't. You got to produce a script every week. And
yes.
in your industry, in your field, do you see that burnout happening with people or young writers having to continuously put out a story, not what I want to say,
Yeah.
but that is getting me the ratings?
It is very much a problem because we have created so many outlets for so many types of stories and such a volume of stories that it becomes very much a microwave culture, where we're used to having things immediately. And great stories often take a long time to tell. When we look at some of the most profound stories that were captured in books, these often took years to write. We have to recognize this is a craft. This is a skill. And the longer we practice this craft and skill, the better we can become at it. There's an interesting story about Picasso, that he was eating once at a cafe over in Spain, and he was sitting there eating, and a woman recognized him, and she came up and she took a napkin and she slid it over to him and she said, "Would you do me a favor and just do a 10-second sketch?" And so he took the napkin and he took out a pen and he did a 10-second sketch, and he slid the napkin back over to her and he said, "That will be $50,000." And she said, "What? It only took you 10 seconds." And he said, "Yes, but it took me 40 years to learn to do that in 10 seconds." And many times we don't recognize the years of craft it takes to go in to tell a great story. We're just focused on the end result because that's what people experience. But those who want to tell good stories, those who want to tell powerful stories, must take the time, just as a musician sits alone in their room and practices their instrument. We too, as storytellers, must practice our craft in order to get to a point to tell stories that compel the human heart in the same way that a song can lift the human soul.
So, John, it's just been a pleasure speaking to you, and I'm definitely going to come back to you. And I hope you can do this again on Indian Genes. But before we let you go, for all the budding writers out there, and they say that there's a book in every person, it's just that you have to get it out. So, what is your motivation to get it done? Somebody who's writing, starting to write, beginning to, and any message that you want to leave uh, with us before we let you go.
Yes. Well, thank you again for having me here on Indian Genes. It has been a real pleasure to be with you again. And I'm already excited about coming back and continuing this conversation with you. My recommendation to any writer, to any storyteller, to any creator is to get up in the morning and make sure you get to your craft before you do anything else. This may involve getting up a little earlier in the morning, but when you get to your craft first thing, even if you can only give it a few minutes or 1 hour, get to your craft first thing in the morning, because then you will go to bed every night knowing that you have moved forward with your craft, regardless of what else has happened in your day. Keep telling stories consistently. I hope you will follow the work that I continue to do in the world. My website, if people want to reach out and see more of what I'm doing, is tellingabetterstory.com. And I'm very active on Instagram if people want to follow me there at Telling a Better Story.
We definitely will. And I've been following your link. And I also think that what you've been talking about with telling a better story is interesting. And I'm going to be posting those links to everybody on this podcast. So, John, once again, from everyone here at Indian Genes, it's always a pleasure. You can always come back and call and speak to us whenever you want to. But I think it's going to be the other way around. We're going to be troubling you more than you. Uh, have a nice time. And before we let you go, anything interesting that you're doing today that our listeners need to know, especially some stuff with the big names?
Well, am right now going to meet with Paramount Studios, which has produced the Mission Impossible films and Indiana Jones and all these different films. But I'm meeting with them about a children's television show that involves mythology. So I hope to be able to make some announcements there soon about what's happening. But we're exploring a children's television show over at Paramount Pictures today.
Amazing, John, and all the best. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.